Thanks everyone for joining us. Welcome to our first Listen event of the year. Today's session is all about the 5 priorities shaping 2026, and more importantly, really about what your organization can plan and build and start embedding in your business. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm gathering from today, the Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respect to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today, and I acknowledge that land was never ceded. So there's a lot of noise around ESG at the moment. We keep having lots of different conversations bouncing off the wall, and we've been talking in our office about how we're all having these same conversations and we need to start singing from the same hymn book. So we're going to talk about new regulations, rising expectations from boards and investors, and a growing sense of we know this matters, but we're not sure where to focus. So this session today with the growth activist is designed to cut through that and provide you with some tools you can walk away and use. Over the next hour, we're going to cover what you can expect in 2026, mandatory climate reporting, what everyone's talking about all the time, risks and opportunities, building transition plans, governance, environmental and social issues, and reporting and AI and how all of that can fit into your plan for ESG for 2026. This session is meant to be really practical, and we've seen the presentation and it's a great one, so I hope you're as excited as we are. With that, I'm going to introduce our speakers from the Growth Activists and get us started. First, we have Rosanna, who's the CEO and co-founder of the Growth Activist. She's a globally experienced leader enabling the transition to a thriving regenerative economy. She's leveraging 3 decades of experience in leadership roles that include Nike, Levi's, and Sheridan. She guides organizations in impactful growth, innovation, and sustainability strategies. She's helped shape the Growth Activist as a go-to partner for B Corp certification and sustainable transformation, integrating environmental, social, governance, and economic factors for resilience and value. We also have Kirsty Simmonds, the ESG practice principal with the team. She has over 30 years experience boosting reputations and bottom lines. Kirsty now champions environmental, economic, social governance, EESG, integration into business strategy and operations. She's a B Corp specialist and she expertly navigates clients through certification. Beyond that, she has global experience spanning sectors from finance to fashion and footwear. Welcome, Kirsty.
Thank you. Okay, thank you everybody for joining today. There are a considerable number of you here today, and we are both excited and very flattered by that. So we look forward to the conversation at the end with your questions and queries about what we speak about today. I'm going to start by stepping back very slightly to last month. So for any of you who followed Davos, you may have seen what was a very interesting conversation, a big picture conversation between Larry Fink, who's the co-chair of the World Economic Forum that hosts Davos, and he is the CEO of mega fund manager BlackRock, and Elon Musk. And I don't need to explain Elon Musk to anybody. I think we all know who he is. And they were discussing the role specifically of tech in advancing civilization. But for me, in the way that I watched it, their debate really captured the almost wicked question that we as sustainability leaders think about every day, which is what is needed for a thoughtful, careful, and fair progress in our world that protects people, planet, and the economies in which we participate and rely on. How do we effectively and successfully and fairly innovate without doing damage, but gaining that upside? And of course, what we do is translate some of those big picture concepts into realities, strategies, and plans for our businesses and for our communities, depending on the type of organization that we are. And we have thought about this from the context of commercial entities, not-for-profits, government organizations, so public serving organizations, and the whole spectrum. Because the trends that we have identified, or the things that we believe we all need to get right, relates to all types of organization. So first, a bit of context, which we're all aware of, which is that the sustainability transition, it's accelerating at the same time that consumerism, demand for energy and technology, they continue to explode despite trying to manage it carefully. They do continue to explode. And on the social front, we know that disparity between the super rich, and I acknowledge that Larry Fink and Elon Musk are two of those people, is greater than ever. 10% of people own and manage 75% of the money, and the rest of us, there's 2% for the most disadvantaged. However, in the context of this presentation, I am going to quote Elon Musk because he said something that actually he's not the first person to say it. My mum has been saying this my whole life. And he said, it's better to be an optimist rather, who has been proved wrong than a pessimist who has been proved right. So that optimistic flavor is the flavor and tone that we bring to today, because there is a lot of opportunity for us as sustainability leaders now more than ever before. So the 5 things we are going to, oh, my screen is not moving. What do I need to do there? All right, excuse me, I need to be getting my screen to, excuse me for a second. I don't know why it's not moving to the next page. Right, I'm just going to put this into a different mode so that I can move the screen. Apologies, it's not going to be beautiful, but it will be functional, and that right now is what we need.
That's all right, Kirsty. We've been doing this since COVID and we all have the same issue.
Oh, I don't know, it's not moving at all. 1 second, bear with me, people.
Kirsty, would you like me to screen share instead?
If you could, that would be really great, because I'm having some functional issues with my slides here. So I'll quickly talk to the five elements that we're going to speak to today. We've given them some nice illustrations so that you can remember them. And they are the economic essentials of ESG. There is a strong economic case to be made, and that is very powerful for all of us. The rise of regulation, the importance of systematic thinking, systematic synthesis, the velocity of value that we can create, and the power of transformative tech. Thank you, Rosanna, I appreciate that. So if we could go to slide 4, that would be brilliant.
Just 1 second, I'm just getting it up. Did that move?
That did. That worked. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. This is my Rosanna CEO. So, all right. So I'm going to speak about the first 2 topics, which are the economic essentials and the rise of regulation. These, well, you could say they're the driest topics, but actually they are 2 very powerful topics for us as leaders. So ESG strategies are now understood broadly as an economic and a financial discipline for an organization, whatever type of organization you are. They are no longer fringe, nice to do things by people wearing Birkenstocks and eating granola, which you're probably like us, we've been accused of that, or bleeding hearts, woke people, whatever it is. We've all been accused of that, but the reality is we are working at the intersection of some very, very powerful concepts, the intersection of what we do for people, planet, and profit and economies is in fact very powerful. So the truth, of course, is that climate change, nature loss, social instability, they're not future risks. They're already affecting the realities of our day-to-day. And they show up in really hard terms. And these are the sorts of things that we will be looking at. So as in within our organizations and our day-to-day, things like the increasing cost of insurance, the availability of insurance, the cost of capital, the price of change, asset values, the importance of understanding our supply chains, and of course, workforce stability. And that's both attracting talent and safeguarding vital workforces that are living in increasingly uninhabitable environments, and human rights inequalities. Now, the importance of that and the significance of that is that recent modelling, particularly, so I have 2 quotes here, one from 2023 on the right-hand side, and one from 2025 on the left-hand side, where Deloitte's economic modelling division called Deloitte Access Economics has actually put a price on this. And by that, I mean a value on some of these practices coming to life. So they have said in 2023, they said that transitioning to net zero, so we're on the right-hand side here, by 2025, in 2023, they said that transitioning to net zero by 2050 adds 35 billion, I'm transposing numbers here, to GDP. That's my optimism coming out, to the GDP. By 2025, they had said a 75% emissions reduction could boost Australia's GDP by 370 million, leaving us nearly, well, $500 billion better off by 2050. That's a mix of operational efficiency by being net energy exporters and other practices. So very real numbers, very significant, meaningful numbers at a national level. What this means for us, and whoever our governing bodies are, whether they are ministerial groups, whether they are policy divisions or our boards and C-suites, the question now that people are asking is not what is the cost and the case for transition, it's what's the cost of delay. And that is really, really important consideration. So let me translate that into other terms. So we've got ESG as an economic driver. ESG is also driving where money is going. And a good practice is always, I hate to say it, but follow the money. If you follow the money, you know what matters in a capitalist society. So across Australia and Aotearoa and New Zealand, responsible investment management practices. Now that is where money is invested using ESG principles, also known as ethical investing or responsible investment principles. They sit on a spectrum, which I can talk about later if you want to, but they continue to grow. So even as global markets are fluctuating, it remains stable in Australia and New Zealand. And these are people that are moving and managing the direction of something like $252 billion in funds. That's a growth of 6.2% between 2024 and 2025 alone, doing it using responsible money management principles as their guiding philosophy and commitment. That is something to be very optimistic about. The second aspect of funding, so I'm sort of back to the previous page if I can, Rosanna.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. In addition to that, funds can be sought through the practice of loans, so example from banks. The global sustainable finance market was estimated to be something like 754 billion in 2024. This is money that is directed towards funding large transitions. But it's projected to reach something like 2.59 trillion. So we've got it in thousands of billions here, but $1 trillion by 2030. That's a compound annual growth rate of 23% between now and 2030. Again, that's a lot of money. Now, sustainable link loans are a very specific type of loan, but they're now a mainstream form of capital. They're priced differently for borrowers based on rewarding ESG performance. They're a tool that are used by very large and hard to abate sectors to help them make those major transitions. So sectors like utilities, property, agriculture, transport, and logistics. So I'm going to give you two examples. In Australia, a recent example from 2025 was Endeavour Energy, an energy company, as the name suggests, secured over $2 billion in a sustainability-linked loan. It was backed by a 17-bank syndicate, and they were given preferential interest rates in exchange for them proving that they could reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, reduce landfill waste and divert it to other uses, and net habitat gain, which is really important. I'll come back to that later. So whilst most of the loans have been tied to environmental performance, social metrics are increasingly becoming important as well. So I'm going to give you an example. Now, this is 5 years old, but this is a very good sign. In 2020, Commonwealth Bank and Wesfarmers entered a bilateral arrangement, which was actually the largest of its time by a single lender, for a $400 million loan to last 3 years. In exchange for preferential rates, Wesfarmers were incentivized to better social outcomes, particularly their commitment to increasing Indigenous employment and enhancing their own environmental incomes through reduced carbon emissions. Now, why is this happening? Because there are also facilities for small and medium businesses through your banks, through commercial lending as well. So across the board for all types of organizations, there is money available for transition. And why is this? Well, investors are investors. They're pretty clear-eyed about the bottom line. 90% of professional investors see sustainability performance as linked to long-term financial outcomes and especially into good governance of organizations, which they see connected to long-term financial outcomes. Super funds in particular see ESG as also being aligned to intergenerational risk management. So Canada and Australia in particular, we wield a lot of power and a lot of influence because of the size of our pension funds. So why does that matter to us? It matters to us because it tells us that demand for this sort of money, thank you for making that change, Rosanna, It's structural now, it's not cyclical. Organizations are motivated to make change, not because it's fashionable or not because it's a value-based decision, but because capital access depends on it. It's a cold, hard truth. Now, the point for us is that we can tie our work now to directly quantifiable business value, organizational value. What we do and the influence we have affects our organization's ability to get money and to perform well in the long term. So for us, this is a positive in terms of increasing the volume of our voice, but we also need to be getting it right. We need to be able to talk in these terms to those leaders and those partners with whom we have relationships. So the next trend is about rising regulation. And for all of us, this we know this has been very challenging for all of us in terms of the use of our time and our brains in recent years. So sustainability reporting is hardwired into many organizations. Climate change, as one example, is not an externality anymore. It's a core measurable financial metric, and we'll come back to that in a minute. It's driving structural economic change. It sits at the heart of regulation and legal risk that all organizations focus on with hawk eyes. Sustainability reporting has typically been a voluntary exercise, but quite widely undertaken until the last couple of years. So 96% of the G250, that's the top largest businesses in the world by revenue, have been reporting on sustainability in some form using models like the Global Reporting Initiative or the TCFD framework, which is the Task Force on Finance-related Climate Disclosures, translating the impact of climate into the financial impact for organizations. But they've been voluntary. And while backed by data, disclosure depth and interpretation has been open to fairly wide variation and has been quite hard for investment decision makers and other decision makers to make decisions, including consumers and including citizens. Simultaneously, the pace of regulation increased. So in 2022, the UN PRI, that's the UN Principles for Responsible Investment Division of the UN, registered over 300 pieces of ESG-related regulation alone in the 3 years from 2019 to 22. That was a 300% increase. And for those of us sitting on the reporting side of things and the management side of things, we felt every single one of those incremental changes. However, the critical thing here is simultaneously, what this was doing, the voluntary program, was creating not only a compliance headache for organizations, it was in fact resulting in people spending more time on compliance than on strategies to address change. And it was creating market fragility and risk. Now, this is a really important point, which of course gets regulators and investors' attention. So what the regulators have done is intentionally tried to stabilize the regulation model and manage the problem of what they saw as hidden exposures, greenwashing, which is overstating what you're doing, and greenhushing, which is understating, and creating this incomparable data. So the tone has changed. Regulators want to move from a voluntary to a compulsory disclosure regime or program, to force regulation, to using regulation or the law as a lever to make progressive, well enforced, and by that I mean well evidenced, accountable practices within organization. And again, we play a critical role here. And the signifying element of that was in 2023 and 24, the IFRS, which is the International Finance-Related Standards Group, of which 94%, the vast majority of countries around the world are signatories, set up a new framework, which they released in 2024, for how to report on sustainability practices in translated into financial and governance terms as one element of it. That has now been progressively rolled out globally, and what you're looking at on screen is the pace of change around the world, who is enforcing or rather rolling out those adaptations of that international framework. So it was a model that was set up for organizations or countries rather to adapt and adopt. So what you can see in the bottom right of the screen is that in fact New Zealand rolled out its regulation before that framework was put in place, and a year before Australia, but it was a similar model built on the same principles and the same pillars before the model was published, but it's still comparable. The concepts and principles and practices were largely the same, which has been very, very useful for Australia to watch what they have done. which means Australia is in fact the first country to embrace the model under the Corporations Act. And from 1 January 2025, the very largest of organisations, it's a three-phase rollout from the very large organisations, $500 million plus, so roughly the size of ASX 100 is a good way of thinking about it in the first year, and then in each year afterwards, progressively smaller organisations through to organisations around the size of an ASX 300, sort of $50 million plus revenue businesses. So the first reports are going to be coming out from the largest organisations this month. So one thing I do want to point out is the regulation that we have embodied into our Corporations Act is specifically focused on one aspect of environmental impact, which is climate change. It's not the whole environmental shebang, but it's a very important start. And whilst it refers to commercial entities, government-managed entities are reporting along similar lines too. We're all affected. And even for organisations that don't report, our emissions will eventually be counted on the books of the clients and organisations and communities that do need to report. So understanding if you're a small provider here today, understanding, for example, your climate footprint is both vital to being a very effective partner, but could give you a competitive advantage. So what this means, of course, is that the work we do is propelled to decision-making tables, whether that's ministerial offices, policymakers, into the C-suite or boardroom. So ESG is no longer something you might report on, it's fully embedded. A couple of lessons that I want to share with you is New Zealand has offered a very useful preview. In their first year, they encouraged organisations in scope to really think about what the material climate change issues are. They didn't have to retranslate them into what that means in monetary terms or financial terms, but just get to grips with the practices. And then from year 2, and these reports are now published, they had to translate them into financial impacts, which is what businesses are doing now. What they have said on balance, at the beginning of this process, when I spoke to New Zealand businesses, they said, wow, working out where on earth all this data is was a bigger headache and took longer than they thought. But now, and this is vital for all of us, governance and building capability is now the hard part and the opportunity. What we can learn from Europe very quickly, and I'm conscious of time, very conscious of time. What we can learn from Europe, they went much broader. They embraced the whole ESG gamut. And very quickly, those of you that are familiar with what's happening in Europe would know that the sort of the breadth and the depth has been a very big load to bear, and they had a very large number of organisations in scope. So what they have done through an omnibus package of legal changes is stripped that back slightly. So reducing the administrative burdens, as they've called it, by about 25%, by narrowing the scope to companies that are larger, so the larger organisations of over 1,000 employees, cutting data points by 70%, which was proving a very substantial problem for organisations, and they've postponed deadlines, so they've relaxed it a little bit. So what does that tell us? It tells us that the process is a huge exercise in change management, and we sit at the centre of that. Now, as I mentioned, we have started with climate, but as sustainability leaders, you also know we're expected to keep an eye on progress and manage today and see around corners. So the sorts of things to think about are keep an eye on what is happening broadly beyond climate into looking at environmental impact issues more broadly, so into nature. And that will be followed swiftly by looking at human rights and social stability. So this is another element to get right. And for me, what that tells me is that as leaders, we are right at the centre of systems level thinking for today and tomorrow. And that is something else for us to exhibit, which we think naturally, but also to get right. And that is a natural segue into what Rosanna will talk about systems level thinking.
Thanks, Kirsty. It's actually a perfect segue, particularly what we're seeing on the radar with the new task force for, that's really focusing on inequality and human rights. The next sort of macro trend and business imperative that we want to address is something we're calling systemic synthesis. And this is about moving beyond fragmented reporting. It's about stitching together the data that we collect for any number of different uses and actually creating a holistic intelligence system. So it's about going beyond data for compliance and actually using it as an engine to transform your entire business model and potentially with other stakeholders to drive true systems change. 6% is the very disappointing statistic around the tiny fraction of global businesses that actually know what's happening at the very beginning of their supply chain. And if you're not in that 6%, you're essentially guessing your footprint. In 2026, we need to seriously start moving from ledger estimates to activity data. And the most efficient way to do this is through a combined journey. So don't go to your suppliers 3 times for 3 different reports, go once. And the opportunity really is to start getting into tiers 3 and 4 and starting to educate those partners now, helping them understand your data requirements of today and also into the future, and knowing that it is going to take them some time to be ready to share the data that you need. And here we are talking about really finding those economies of scale between in extracting data that's both social and environmental. We know there's a lot on the horizon, and a lot of perhaps the reporting that's been quite superficial is going to deepen in the social space as well. We now have a federal anti-slavery commissioner in Chris Evans, who is agitating for legislative reform. And so that deeper understanding of your supply chain is going to be a likely requirement, as there's actually a body now with teeth around poor reporting that doesn't go deep enough. So starting that work is really important, being realistic that it may be a 2 or 3 year journey until you're able to map all of that supply chain data, doing that in line with your other strategic priorities. But I think the point I want to make here, it's not just a compliance task, it's about building your infrastructure for the next decade of regulation and for the next decade of product transparency. And it's also about just transition in taking these indirect partners with you into the future. So deeper supply chain mapping does remain a fundamental priority in 2026. And the question in 2026 is shifting also around, it's not just can you deliver, but can you prove how you delivered? So we're seeing a massive shift where ESG is now becoming a gatekeeper in global procurement. According to Thomson Reuters, 81% of trade professionals are now using ESG as a primary filter for supplier selection. And this isn't just about ethics, it's actually about their survival. So major entities can't file their own mandatory reports without your data. And by stitching this data together now, you aren't just complying, you're actually positioning yourself as the lowest risk partner in the eyes of the world's biggest buyers. By 2027, a product without a digital product passport is going to be a product with an expiration date. We're moving from trust us marketing to verify it data. Digital product passports, they're not just labels, they're actually digital twins. And for the first time, a brand can actually see where its product is 3 years after the sale date. This data is really intended, or the initial intent of the legislation was to empower consumers to make purchases so that they're equipped with essential insights on product provenance and sustainability credentials. But I think what is really exciting and the opportunity here is that it also allows businesses to automate authenticity checks for the resale market and even earn royalties on every secondhand transaction. More on that in a minute. And this is where systemic synthesis as a concept really pays off. You're stitching together material data at the start. You're creating a permanent asset that drives loyalty, repair revenue, and brand credibility for a decade or more. And here we look at what is regarded as the holy grail of the circular economy. So for the first time, brands aren't losing the customer after the first sale. They're treating their consumer goods like music or software, as intellectual property. So let's look at a case study, B Corp certified luxury label Chloe. So they've stitched a digital identity into their leather goods, working with tech partner Eon, and they've created a permanent link to the product. When that bag is resold on resale platform Vestiaire Collective, Chloe gets a royalty. The data is what makes the transaction automatic. And there's also platforms like The Vault, who are operating in Australia and the UK, and they're also scaling this to the rental market. And this is really systemic synthesis in action. It's using supply chain data to authenticate a product so it can be monetized again and again, long after it leaves the store. And then let's not forget the consumer who in 2026 with Cosy Lives, does everyone know that term, Cosy Lives? I love it. The cost of living pressure. They are incredibly financially savvy. They're not just shopping, they're investing in the new products that they purchase, and they're using data to do it. According to ThreadUp, nearly 2/3 of younger shoppers actually check an item's resale potential before they hit the buy button. They're really seeing their clothes as a closet as ATM, something they can turn back into cash whenever they want to. And for brands, this means that durability is now a requirement. And I'm not just talking about physical durability, which comes with higher quality goods. I'm also talking about emotional durability or emotional longevity. And that happens when you put a bit of love into a product, and usually it's good branded goods that have original design and are able to actually claim that emotional longevity. And so you need to now prove that longevity, both physical and emotional, through digital product passports, so your customer can actually trust the resale value. So for consumer goods businesses in particular, stitching durability data into the product, you can enable that very circular behavior that builds long-term loyalty and commercial success. And finally, very closely linked to this theme is something that needs to be noted. B Corp, which is the gold standard in certifications, just raised the bar significantly with its version 2.1 standards that went live 2 days ago as the only way for businesses to certify and recertify going forward. We're moving away from this old system where you could, to a certain degree, pick and choose where to score points. Now you must meet a minimum mandatory floor across every single impact area, from climate action to fair work. And for the first time, this is backed by independent auditors to ensure total data integrity. So the real magic in the new standards is interoperability. B-Lab has really built the new standards to talk to global regulations like the EU CSRD. And this means you aren't doing double the work. You're stitching your B Corp data directly into your legal compliance, creating one single powerful source of truth. Just really amazing economies of scale for businesses. So going forward, B Corp will become, I believe, an even more credible hallmark of verified impact. The next theme is value velocity. So in 2026, we're going to reach this tipping point. It's the year that ESG must shift from cost of compliance to a rapid driver of value. Market leaders are now using sustainability as a high-performance engine, and they're ensuring that spend becomes a strategic driver of competitive advantage and ROI. I mean, that's not to say that the moral imperative has gone away, but we're in a VUCA environment, we're in a challenging economic environment, the pace of change has increased, and that pressure to deliver results is more significant than ever, and it just needs to be noted. We've spent the last few years really treating ESG as a defensive shield to manage risk, but in 2026, the value velocity trend actually flips that script. It's no longer about doing less bad, it's actually about using sustainability as an offensive weapon for growth. The Cambridge Institute calls this competitive sustainability. They published a paper on it early last year, which is really worth diving into if you haven't seen it. It's the transition from compliance to market leadership. When you solve a global problem for your sector, like decarbonisation or social equity, You're not just checking a box, you're actually securing your future market share. And as Cambridge puts it, sustainability is not a cost to be managed, but a driver of innovation. So next, let's take a look at how that innovation can translate into communication. So data alone is just a cost center, but to create value velocity, you have to turn that data into a story that solves a problem for someone else. And one of our favorite case studies comes from Maersk. So Maersk didn't just sell low carbon fuel when they moved into the transition to biofuels. They actually told a story about reliability and shared goals with their customers. They actually gave their customers a narrative that they could use to tell their own stakeholders that they were hitting their targets. They made their customers the heroes of the decarbonisation story. And in the work we've been doing with customers around translating their ESG efforts into a narrative that really aligns with customers' values, our focus isn't just on reporting on the past, but also starting to sell a future that those customers want to be a part of. And finally, let's talk about enterprise value. And if you want to know what your business is really worth in 2026, you need to look at your governance structure. As we heard from Kirsty, investors have been focused on evidence around social and environmental risk management, but now they're also looking for governance premiums. In other words, mathematical proof that your ESG strategy is baked into your board oversight and into your operations. According to a 2025 study by KPMG, this translates into cold hard cash. 66% of deal makers will pay more for a company with high ESG maturity. And we're seeing valuation bumps of up to 10% purely because a company can prove its governance is resilient. So good ethics is now officially good equity as well. Back to you, Kirsty.
Thank you. So in thinking about the trends and the things to get right, we've taken you through how ESG has been at the center of practices being a gateway to access money as a way of managing risk and compliance and opportunities within an organization to make sure that you're sort of legally compliant and reporting what you're doing, translating what you're doing into real cold hard financial benefit terms, which can inform much better decisions. Rosanna's taken you through some amazing innovation and the concepts around ESG now as being a very compelling at the forefront of what organizations are thinking. Of course, a lot of this has to be underpinned by tech as an enabler. And AI forms much of the discussion that we're hearing about at the moment. And I'm going to focus on that for the purposes of this last point, simply because there is so much conversation about it. And I want to take you back. If you haven't watched it, I really do encourage you, we can send a link, to listen to the sort of 30-minute conversation between Fink and Musk, because it is a conversation at the macro level of how technology can really advance civilization. And they talk about the importance of sharing the spoils. So what does that mean for, oh, thank you, Dudley, thank you very much. Yes, we'll send the link around because it's actually very interesting, very big picture conversation that I find really fascinating. So Musk's position, of course, was that technology is the force for an abundant future. And an abundant future is something that we all can agree with. I think the inequality of distribution of wealth is a whole different subject, but let's focus on the abundant future side of things. And the power of AI as a force is not really the debate point anymore. It's kind of the given. It's how we achieve the maximum potential, which brings us to a couple of issues. The technology pace of change at the moment is outstripping the amount of energy we can actually provide to switch it on. And in fact, one of the things that is said is that we are producing chips, for example, at a faster pace than the world can switch them on. We don't have enough sources of energy, and let alone renewable energy, to be able to do so. So to unlock some of the potential, and he in particular talks very big picture beyond AI models, obviously talking about autonomous machines, about rockets, he talks about solar farms in space. And actually, if you want to understand some of the physics, I found that really interesting, but I'm a bit of a science nerdy brain anyway, but it is very, very interesting. It suddenly makes sense of a lot of things for me, or made sense, but they all depend on massive increases of compute power and massive increases in energy, expensive energy, at the moment resource limited. energy, which makes it even more expensive. So what's my point? My point is, and I'll come to this in a second, AI is without doubt a really important part of our ESG and any technology as part of our ESG infrastructure and toolbox. But this is an area where we absolutely have to balance the reality of where we're at the moment and the ethics. So this puts us as, if you like, we're in a position where we can be the conscience. We need to be a conscience of an organization or reflect the conscience of an organization. So if we go to the next slide, the ways in which AI is a strategic enabler, I think we will probably already know this. Its ability to process and manage and synthesize gigantic amounts of data is just amazing. It's absolutely amazing. So it can inform strategy. It can help us with real-time monitoring, again, by managing large swathes of data. It will help us globally and individually as organizations start to pick apart the elements that comprise scope 3 emissions, so those emissions that are not our energy and not within our direct control, they're within our total value chain, and where there is will be a lot of double counting, let alone the ability to actually see where all the scope 3 emissions are coming from, as Rosanna, referencing back to what Rosanna said about understanding your supply chain. It can help us with this sort of enormous processing power again to decipher scope 3 and quantify them accurately, which provides us with reporting support. And that matters to us as leaders because we don't want to spend our time reporting. We actually want to be focused on, because reporting is retrospective, we want to be focusing on the future, on the strategic thinking. It frees our minds to do what we probably all got into this career to do in the first place. And that means it is leaving space for building internal capability, which is absolutely vital. But it's always a balance. And so on the next slide, there are some things to consider. The governance of AI is critical. Boards are increasingly talking about, for example, thinking about understanding the ethics of AI. These are things like the simple stuff that we're all aware of and we joke about, the accuracy of information, the hallucinations. I mean, I tried to make a Christmas card last year and I asked it to provide me with a particular image and it showed me a lady with 3 legs with red shoes. Pass. Don't know where it came from. Very interesting, but it does that with text and facts as well. We've got to be able to know and be very aware and check our facts. And we have seen some examples where that has come back and unfortunately bitten some organizations a bit with insufficient fact checking, which not only damages reputations, but can result in legal issues. But worse than that, and this is actually the big picture issue, it can result in inaccurate, poor decisions. So this is, again, thinking very carefully about what it can do. There is, without question, an issue about data ethics and ownership. Who owns what? If you think of something and some AI agent spits it out somewhere else, who owns it? IP is an issue as well. There is bias in modeling. And I read a study, now this is not to do with our day-to-day, but it was a very interesting insight. It was analysis, I think it was in the BBC, and they reported about the psychological damage of individuals, particularly to young women who were putting their photographs into AI services and saying, do I meet what looks like or match up to what contemporary view of beautiful looks like? Well, the contemporary view of beautiful was a very specific, very defined, limited definition of a symmetrical face, probably a Western looking face. And this is eroding the psychological health of individuals. So again, we've got to really think about bias in modeling from recruitment right through to whatever else we might be asking it to model. And then, of course, for those that are responsible for reporting, the information, the lineage of it, the provenance of it, the accuracy of it must be traceable. We have to have confidence because ultimately, when you're doing a report, the auditors need to be able to trace that information back. Otherwise, they will not sign off your report. And no CFO on the planet wants to be producing a report that an auditor will not sign off. And then, of course, finally, there is the issue about the energy consumption, thinking about the advance of technology being matched with the ability for us to keep focusing on our essential decarbonisation strategies. So I've posed both sides of the consideration about transformative tech for you. And my take on it is that this is where we get to be that sort of complex, sophisticated thinker in an organisation that is balancing both sides of things and thinking about the values and the conscience of it, being about the conscience of an organisation. Obviously not the only conscience within an organisation, but voicing it and thinking about it. So in closing, I still remain, as I said before, very, very optimistic. I think there's a couple of messages to take away. The first is that ESG is now more widely understood than ever, that it's about doing things differently and proving its worth. It's not about asking ourselves and our colleagues to do more. It's doing things differently and more effectively. And this is a future that we can build. We can build it intentionally, or we can let it be built around us. And so the thing to get right, I think, is to do so intentionally. So that closes our thinking for the beginning of 2026. And if you have questions, we would love to take them. Thank you.
Thank you both. This is such a great presentation, like so much to digest in there. I wanted to mention one thing. Rosanna, you were talking about making your data tell a story and really selling a future. And I love that so much. And Kiarn always mentions this and shouting it from the rooftops, like stopping the green hushing and removing the fear. So we can allow people to, and brands to feel more confident and safe in telling their story and just take the next best step. I think that's so important in part of the work that we do.
Definitely.
Yeah, I'm gonna selfishly as well start with my own question and then I'll jump into the chat and answer everyone else's. It kind of ties to some things that you both said, but Kirsty, you were mentioning how Europe really embraced the whole ESG gambit, and it looks like it's going to be a pretty huge success in comparison to other places. And that's pretty clear in their DPP requirements alone, I think. And then Rosanna, you mentioned how digital product labeling, like we all here know that a unified and agnostic system would be the easiest to implement far and wide and it'd make the greatest impact. So how do we build the business case to bring everyone on board so that Australia is not a laggard in this space? Is it government intervention or like strong arm of capitalism or just boots on the ground people like the folks here? How do you think we'll be able to get that done?
I'll have a go at this, and then Kirsty, please chime in. And I think, particularly using digital product passports as, as the example, I do think that any business that is trading in the EU and, that they have no choice but to accelerate their work on DPPs. They need to be compliant, particularly, if they're doing significant volumes in that part of the world. And, I do think that the regulation itself is going to be a significant driver of that acceleration and that uptake. And I also think that once that happens, and you've got Australian businesses that trade internationally that are doing that, and their product is also in the market in Australia, they start to have a competitive advantage, particularly with consumers. Those consumers are seeing that essential data. I think, the jury is still out on how quickly consumer uptake will happen. I think that will take a while. I think it's really important to be honest around how quickly that will happen. But eventually, as it does become, and there's always a cohort of, of thought leaders and fast followers who will go there first. But eventually, it will become a competitive advantage, and businesses that only trade in Australia will want to catch up. So I think they will be the drivers. At the same time, I also sit on the board of Seamless, and I know that a lot of these product stewardship organisations will also be putting forward a position around policy, and they're working together. I think that's a really exciting thing. A lot of the product stewardship organisations are really coming together and lobbying on policy as a block, which I think is another pretty powerful force.
Yeah, I think that's so great and so good to see all the work that Seamless is doing to push that forward for fashion. It'll be a really fun industry to watch and see if they are those early adopters and how they get it moving. All right, I'll jump into some chat questions and quit being hog. So we have a question. Someone is interested in the transition of mandatory reporting from TCFD to IFRS and embedding sustainability in the financial reporting. Are there any training sessions for these, or especially for people who are not coming from a financial background?
That is a very good question. I can't tell you how many. I've actually lost count of the number of training sessions and conferences I've been to in the last 12 months. Look, from regulator presentations to investor relations to I've even participated in CFO sessions to understand this. I have not found yet a single training session that encapsulates everything, but a good place to start, a couple of good places to start. The Australian Institute of Company Directors has a very good paper that you can download for free about considerations. They also have a program that you can run that is not free, but the paper is free about the transition and the things that organizations, they come from the perspective of a board, but nonetheless, this is a very good overview about what you need to know and what needs to be put into place. There are some great videos on YouTube about the practical application available from, for example, the Australian Accounting Standards Boards. They are written and presented in a way that non-financial. I'm not a financial person. I've worked in the sector, but I'm not a financial a finance professional. But I can understand and appreciate what they are doing. Or rather, I can appreciate and understand what they're saying. So there are some very good sources on YouTube as one, and literally I've been using those. We have started to run some sessions, and look, I think it's up to Kian and the team, but we could run not so much a training session, but an overview session with some hands-on things to understand, because we are really getting to grips with not just the concepts in the regulation, but how does it translate into methodologies and practices you actually need to understand as an organization. And our own CFO could even talk to some of the financial sides of it in non-finance language, and she does that very, very well. So that could be an option. Bottom line is, I've done a lot of searching online. What I can do, I will probably prepare it before the end of the week, is share some of the best resources I found, if that's useful, as a little fact sheet. Save you that task, because there is good information around. It just takes a bit of sifting through. But I get where you're coming from in terms of non-financial background.
Yeah, and I might just quickly add to that. When we are taking our mandatory climate reporting clients through their ASRS sort of compliance journey, we do actually do training in-house for those organisations to a number of different functions that need to be brought up to speed. So that it is a commercial offering, but we haven't really thought about taking it out of that context and perhaps offering it, if there's demand for it, that's definitely something that we can explore as standalone training.
Awesome. All right, we have another question from Kian. At a time when a lot of brands are waiting to see what the industry does first or what a regulator is going to do first, how are you convincing and influencing clients to be a leader and invest in ESG when others are dragging their feet?
I'll take a stab at that. I think it is, I think the macro trend that speaks to that is value velocity, right? I think it is about saying and working with them to uncover how the investment or how this cost can be turned into an investment. That is really the biggest driver, I think, at the moment for getting organizations across the line with, resources spread so thin. There are so many other transformation priorities, particularly digital and AI transformation is starting to become a huge one within organizations. And this is a competing priority. So demonstrating that ROI is really, really critical. I think one of the things that is working really well within that is the stakeholder engagement opportunity. You've collected all of this data. You've got to do it for regulatory purposes. You're sitting on it. How do you now how do you turn it into stakeholder specific narratives, whether you're communicating to customers, suppliers, your regulators, the local community that you operate in, your philanthropic partners, and tailoring all of your impact for different audiences to create deeper levels of engagement, with a priority being customers, of course, a little bit like the Maersk example. That is really, if the question is how do you get them across the line in terms of hand in the pocket and making the investment, that is certainly the biggest driver right now.
And we're hearing from sales teams, for example, so enterprise-wide sales teams that are saying without good governance and without practices in place and the data about their organization, they're not even getting onto tender lists. So the sales teams are driving some of the ESG acceleration within organizations because they're not even getting a foot in the door for those conversations. They're not getting in. So
sorry, and I will add one.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Kirsty, I didn't mean to talk over you. I will add one more. Look, and I do think the other big driver is the business value component, access to capital, and how much they can command for the sale of their business at exit. If they are in a private equity context, or they're looking at some sort of trade sale of their organization down the track, not being up to scratch, there is definitely a driver that, it is a risk-based approach. And certainly for listed entities, it's making sure that they stay in favour with the investor community. So, they're the other drivers.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's all right. I'm just thinking breaking down all those silos and really getting your marketing team and comms team and your sales team and your finance team all on board and getting that buy-in across everything is what we're going to have to do, isn't it?
Yes, and referring back to the comment about stakeholders, for anybody here who might work for a public organization, I mean, your stakeholders are your citizens, and there's an increasing expectation and an assumption that, well, my local council, my state body, etc., they're bound to be doing something, aren't they? Well, yes, they need organizations, public sector organizations need to be doing something because citizens are expecting it. So it goes back to that point about understanding what each of your stakeholders' expectations are of you. Reinforcing that point, just for anyone that's not in a commercial entity who might be on the call.
Yeah, totally. All right, I'm going to get one more question in before I close. Is there anything out there like the Seamless in a product manufacturing space? The work Seamless does is amazing, and there's a lot of overlap into product as a whole, but she's asking from a footwear lens, but would love to hear about anything that isn't purely textile focused.
There are a lot of product stewardship organizations emerging at the moment. My understanding is that there isn't a footwear specific one in Australia. There is one organization, their name is not coming to mind right away, that have been working on footwear recycling for a very long time, but it's not a full product stewardship scheme. But I think it's, even for organizations that are textiles adjacent, I do think it is really worth watching the work of Seamless, maybe joining as a supporter, which actually doesn't have a cost to it to join as a supporter versus as a member, and to stay close to the dynamics of what's happening. I know my understanding is in the short term, Seamless does not have any intentions to expand to footwear anytime soon. The next sort of milestone is really incorporating uniforms as well. But yeah, I don't think there is a plan there. But I would watch all of the product stewardship schemes, and look, I'm sure a footwear one will emerge before, sometime in the next few years. But there is a lot of really, really interesting activity happening in the space, with more and more coming up.
Yeah, that's so great to see, isn't it?
It is.
Awesome. Well, I'm very conscious of time. I don't want to hold anyone over time on the first session back. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us live today. It's so great to be back with the Listen group and getting everyone online and working hard to deliver the good work. And thank you so much to Rosanna and Kirsty for your time and creating this content for us to all dive into and digest, and for your optimism in a space where we're all heads down trying to get it done all the time. It's really incredible when we can come together and share and learn from one another instead of gatekeeping. So I thank you so much. So have a great day, everyone, and see you at the next one.
Thank you. That was awesome. Cheers, guys.